It's time to introduce the speaker. What is it, about 20 years now?
What's that? You and me?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
You know how we always say in AA that you will meet people that you would never mix with outside? Well, I could tell you for a fact that that would not happen between us two gentlemen on this stage. But I love this man dearly. He has taught me that anger is not really a good thing, that my ego is definitely bigger than his, and has helped me to cut it down to size on many of an occasion. When we went to pick our speaker for NERASSA 2013, Jay Gary's name was the first one that popped up, obviously, because he's from Eastern Pennsylvania and he's our NorthEast Regional Trustee. But there were 4 or 5 other names that were tossed into the hat. We found out that he had not yet spoken at a regional event here in the Northeast, so we felt that he was the best choice. Some of us in this room have heard Gary before, and we are not going to be disappointed if we hear him again. So please help me welcome J. Gary L.
My name is Gary, and I'm an alcoholic. My home group is the Miller Heights Group of Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. My sobriety date is May 26, 1990, and I currently have the honor and privilege of serving you as your regional trustee on the General Service Board. Just to make one correction in your story, I understood that the 4 other names in the hat turned you down. But that's all right. I'm honored to be here. And I do thank the Planning Committee, not only for the generous invitation to come share with you this evening, but for all the hard work they've put in this weekend. And I'm, once again, yes. I am a little disappointed to see the number of people in the room that have heard me speak before. I had a new, really slick version of my story that made me look really good. But with all these reliability checks in the audience, I think we're going to have to stick with the truth. I want to be mindful of your time and your endurance. And I always have to remember the guy who came to the podium and said, I'm not really sure where to begin. And a voice from the back said, as close to the end as possible. So I want to tell you a bit about what it used to be like, how I got here, and what it's like now. And I remember hearing a guy share that if he had known he was going to have to share what it used to be like, he'd have paid closer attention. But we'll do our best. When many of us begin our stories, we hear tales of alcoholism in the homes in which we grew up. But that wasn't my story. My father was the principal of a local elementary school, and he was what my generation referred to as a straight arrow, a very proper gentleman. And my mother was a little Quaker lady. And if you know anything about that faith, you know that the traditional Quakers, her parents, my grandparents, the thee and thou Quakers, preached total abstinence from alcohol. The more modern Quakers, my mom's generation, preached moderation in all things. So there was alcohol in the home, but there was never any sign of misuse or abuse. And that was the kind of environment in which I grew up. And as I entered my teen years, I developed what I suppose was a normal curiosity about alcohol. I began to hear tales about my friends getting alcohol and going out and getting drunk and having all sorts of adventures. And I remember thinking, gee, if I could just be a part of this drinking thing, maybe I could be one of the guys. Because I was never part of the in crowd. I was always more a part of this group. The pocket protector group. But I had an extra added layer of curiosity because when my mom's parents, the very traditional Quakers, would come to visit, my parents would hide the liquor That had to be some pretty special stuff to get deceptive behavior out of my proper parents. And so I got my chance. I took my first drink on December 31st, 1959. I was 16. It was New Year's Eve. That night I drank beer, and I concluded that evening what we used to call driving the porcelain bus. But very much aware that I'd had my first drink, my first drunk, and that my life was about to change in a fundamental way because of alcohol. I took my last drink on May 25th, 1990. I was 46. It was no special occasion. That night I drank everything I could get my hands on, and I concluded that evening in the back seat of a Bethlehem City police car, totally unaware that I had had my last drink, my last drunk, and my life was again about to change in a fundamental way because of you people. On that first occasion and on that last occasion and on every occasion in between, I drank like an alcoholic. I drank to get drunk. Because in the beginning, I loved that feeling. It seemed to fill in so many missing pieces for me. And as was the case with all of us, that eventually turned on me. But in the beginning, I loved it. And I got my chance to have my adventures. And I had the same adventures that you people had. I had adventures with automobiles. I drove a Volkswagen up a telephone pole guy wire and had to be crowbarred out of the wreck. I had adventures with places. I got stuck in a chimney. I had adventures with weapons. I got into a saber fight. And as it turns out, I'm not a very good swordsman, drunk or sober. Ended up in the local emergency room being stitched up. I had adventures with poor judgment. A number of us were attending a wedding in Connecticut, and we'd been drinking all day, and we were driving home. I was a passenger in the car, and I had to heed the call of nature, and I informed the driver of that, and then stepped from the car while it was still going about 40 miles an hour. As it turns out, the human body does bounce. And I ended up at the bottom of the river. I had adventures with employers. I taught high school for a couple of years. And it turns out that your local school board takes a very dim view of its faculty chasing citizens through the street at 4 a.m. with a switchblade. And I had adventures with hospitality. I got thrown out of any number of places, sometimes quite bodily. I remember one incident, I was in a restaurant, and because of my behavior, 2 Neanderthal men just appeared behind me and bodily picked me up out of my chair, carried me out the front door, threw me over a guardrail, down an embankment, onto a gravel parking lot. But sometimes the extraction was much more gentle. A number of us were attending a function at the Junior League in New York City, very posh. And they had a harpist in the lobby. And we were asked to leave after having threatened to cut her strings if she wouldn't play Hard-Hearted Hannah for us. Now, I tell these stories now for the cheap laugh, but the fact of the matter is they weren't funny. I was an embarrassment to myself, to my family, to my friends. I put myself and those around me at risk. And I went from that fun-loving drunk who was throwing meat cleavers through doors and getting furniture broken over his head to an isolated, sullen, nasty drunk. And I went from an occasional drinker to a weekend drinker to a daily drinker who in the last decade of his drinking drank himself unconscious virtually every single day. But my descent into full-blown alcoholism didn't happen overnight. I was pretty functional there for a while. I got married. And I can best describe that relationship as 2 dysfunctional people in a dysfunctional relationship. But I certainly didn't see my contribution to the problem. And I treated it like I treated every other problem. I threw alcohol at it, and I turned my back on it. And even into early recovery, I didn't see my role in the destruction of that relationship. I maintained for the longest time that my wife was Satan's daughter. But I've been coming around for a few 24s, and with the benefit of your teaching and counsel, I've come to believe that she's probably only his niece. I had 2 beautiful daughters, and time permitting, before we're finished, we'll hear from one of them. I acquired some degrees and embarked on a career as a university professor, and oddly enough, I'm still there. And the only reason I mention that is because, in my opinion, being an academic is probably the single most enabling career that you can give an alcoholic. To illustrate, in 1976, I was awarded academic tenure. And in true alcoholic fashion, I went to my department chair and I said, okay, what does this entitle me to? And he put it very crudely. And I apologize for him because I'm going to tell you what he said. He said, here's the way tenure works. As long as you're not caught in bed with a dead student, you have a job for life. That was just the sort of flexibility I was looking for. I moved a refrigerator into my office the next day, and I was off to the races. And, of course, the inevitable progressions set in. You know, first drinking was fun, and then it was fun with problems, and then it was just problems. Drinking started out to be simply part of my life, and then I planned my drinking around my life, and then I planned my life around my drinking, and then finally I just drank. And the inevitable declines set in. Health declined, job performance declined, marriage declined, relationship with my children declined. And the world was not responding very positively to my drinking. To illustrate, in the last probably year or so of my drinking, on separate occasions, because of my behavior, I was slapped, punched, clawed, bludgeoned, cut with a razor, attacked with a butcher knife, and an attempt was made to run me down in a car. And that was just my wife. The rest of the world wasn't responding very positively, but I mentioned that litany of abuse to remember that I permitted that to be done to me, because on some level I must have believed that I deserved it. And that was one of the dark places that alcohol took me. And I began to get a suggestion that perhaps my drinking was out of control. And so I began to try to control it. And I went through the programs that I'm sure many of us have gone through. I decided, okay, I'm going to only purchase a certain amount of alcohol at the beginning of the week, and when that was gone, that was going to be it until the next purchase date. Well, I started borrowing into the next weeks, and I think the debt was paid off about a month ago. So. And then I decided, okay, that's not working, so I'm going to limit the amount of money that I spend on alcohol. I'm going to allocate a certain amount of money, and when that was gone, that was it. I wasn't going to buy anymore. And all that led to is me buying cheaper and cheaper stuff. And then I changed what I drank, and I changed what I mixed it with, and I changed the time of day that I started, and on and on and on. And at no time did it ever occur to me that normal people don't do that. Normal people don't have to initiate control programs over their drinking. And so finally, the whole house of cards came down in the fall of 1989. My marriage crashed and burned. And as I left my nice 3-story house on the west side of Bethlehem, the nice part of town, and moved into a 1-bedroom apartment over a Chinese restaurant in South Bethlehem, the not-so-nice part of town. As I drove out of the driveway the last time with my few paltry possessions, leaving behind a marriage of 18 years, my children, my home, my stuff, the one crystal clear thought I remember having was, now I can drink in peace. Because no matter how badly alcohol was beating me up, no matter how close it was coming to killing me, I couldn't imagine life without it. And that was another dark place that alcohol had taken me. And continued to drink, I did. And there would be incidents like the night my kids came to visit me and the fire alarm went off in the building and they couldn't wake me up out of a drunken stupor. And mercifully, it was a false alarm, but had it not been, the story would have had a very different ending. And I just continued to slide down that slippery slope of alcoholism, and I continued to have those Dr. Phil moments. What were you thinking? And I continued living up to Robin Williams' definition of an alcoholic. He said, you know you're an alcoholic when you do things that make the devil turn and look at you and go, dude, seriously? And the whole thing culminated in a humiliating scene in May of 1990 involving me, my ex-wife, her soon-to-be new husband, the Bethlehem police, me too drunk to pronounce my name, too drunk to remember where I lived. But the next morning, as far as I was concerned, it was going to be drinking business as usual. But at that point, a young lady had come into my life who had been watching this destructive behavior for some time, and she sat me down and she said, don't you think you need help? And I began our dance of denial. Help with what? And she said, help with your drinking. And I said, oh no, I'm drinking a lot less than I used to, and it's really under control. You know, the sort of things we do. Now, she's a very bright person. In fact, she's probably the smartest person I've ever met. And she is perceptive, and she is insightful, and she is persistent. And she eventually boxed me into a corner where I had to admit that, well, maybe I kind of sort of possibly do have what might be a drinking problem. But I have no idea where to go to get help for it. And she said, well, at the very least, why don't you go to the Employee Assistance Program at work, the EAP. And I remember hearing a guy share once that he'd been encouraged to see the EAP. He thought they said the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency. And he said in his case that probably would have been appropriate. But I still continued to dance around, and eventually she said, look, either do it or don't, but don't play this game. And finally I said, fine. First thing Monday morning, I'll call the EAP and make an appointment with one of the addictions counselors and see what's what. Now, as I say, she's very insightful. And she looked at me and she said, why are you agreeing to do this? And I thought, I'm going to score some points here. And I said, I'm doing it for you. And she said, don't bother. It's not that I don't care for you, but don't do it for me. Don't do it for your kids. Don't do it for your parents. Don't do it for your boss. If you don't believe that you deserve a better life than you're leading now, then don't waste everybody's time, because you're just going to find a reason not to continue. And that was the first time that anyone had come close to talking program to me. Now, she's not in our program. She, in all probability, will never have to be in our program. She's one of these odd creatures who can take a glass of wine every 6 weeks, and when she's offered a second, says, oh no, I'm beginning to feel it. What is that? She can drink and chooses not to. I maintained for the longest time in recovery that if only I weren't an alcoholic, I would drink all the time. As I say, she's the brightest person I've ever met, and the only flaw in her judgment that I've ever seen was some years later when she agreed to be my wife. I credit her with putting my feet on the path that led me to you people. And if I didn't have so many other reasons to love her, I would love her for that alone. However, since she's not here to defend herself, I will share with you that there are easier things for an alcoholic than to be married to a nationally certified behavior analyst. A lot of 10th steps in my house. And not just the kind you're familiar with. She's got her own version. That's where she continues to take my inventory, and when I am wrong, promptly informs me. I love her anyway. She does have one blind spot, though, when it comes to AA lingo. She just can't seem to get it straight. As I say, she's not a member of our program. Instead of one day at a time, she says day by day. Instead of carrying the message, she says spreading the word. And my favorite, she refers to our founders as Dr. Bob and Mr. Bill. And the more I tell that, the more I realize she does it just to piss me off. So I did go to my first AA meeting. Or I'm sorry, I did go to the EAP. And I talked with the addictions counselor, and she asked me what I drank, and I told her, and she asked me how much I drank, and I told her, and she asked me how often I drank, and I told her, and she asked me what it did to me when I drank, and I told her, and she said, you got to get to a rehab. And I said, no. Now, I didn't know what a rehab was, but it sounded to me like the sort of thing that if I went there, people would know I was a drunk. Like it was the best kept secret in the community. But I was steadfast. I said I wasn't going to do it. And she said, well, at the very least, you need to go to an AA meeting. And I thought, I can do that. Because I knew what AA was. I was a well-read, worldly, erudite young man. I knew what AA was. I'd go to a church. There'd be a bunch of raggedy old men in trench coats. We'd be talked at by the clergy for an hour, have some soup, sing a hymn, and go home. I knew what AA was. And so I did go to my first AA meeting. And as you know, I got the church part right, but nothing else. And I walked in, and I found you people. Both genders, a mix of ethnicities, a range of ages, folks from all walks of life, people. I found people. And many of us say when I walked into my very first AA meeting, I felt immediately at home. But that wasn't my experience. I walked in and you people were talking and laughing, and you obviously knew one another, and you were comfortable with who you were and where you were. And I was lonely and frightened and embarrassed and sick at heart. And you had no idea how miserable I was. Well, of course you did. You'd been there and worse. But I didn't see that on that first day. I just saw people comfortable in their skin. And of course, you made matters worse. The meeting began, and the general chair said, good afternoon, everyone. My name's Bob, and I'm an alcoholic. And everybody went, hi, Bob! And I thought, my God, they really like Bob. And they're never going to like me that much. But I kept coming around. I say I walked in and I found you people, but more importantly, I found myself. I remember an early speaker meeting that I went to where the speaker was a young African-American woman, and I thought at the beginning of the hour, wow, she and I couldn't be more different. She was female, I was male, she was black, I was white, she was young and attractive, I was some other stuff. She had had a horrendous, abusive childhood, ending up living on the street, subjecting herself to all sorts of indignities just to keep alive. And I'd had a rather vanilla upbringing. I mean, we weren't conventionally well off, but I always had a roof over my head, clothes on my back, food on the table, and parents who cared about me. But at the end of the hour, after listening to her share about her struggles with alcohol and her struggles with recovery, and her hopes and her aspirations and her fears, I remember thinking, wow, we couldn't be more alike. And that's been my experience in every AA room I've gone into, that I always find a little bit of me in each one of you. And I wish I could tell you a story that sounds like, so I immediately adopted a home group and recruited a sponsor, started working the steps, voraciously reading every piece of AA literature I could get my hands on, began sponsoring dozens of young men who went on to be trusted servants within AA and pillars of the community outside of AA. And, of course, none of that happened. I wasted, or at least none of that happened right away. I wasted an enormous amount of time in early sobriety, wondering, am I really an alcoholic? Is alcohol really my problem? And you told me the story of the guy who went to the doctor and said, Doctor, I don't know what's wrong. When I go like this, it hurts. 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 And the doctor said, you know what? I think you have a broken finger. And that was me. I didn't see the pattern. When I drank, I had marital problems. When I drank, I had kid problems. When I drank, I had health problems. When I drank, I had money problems. When I drank, I had work problems. But I didn't see the pattern. I just thought I had wife problems, kid problems, health problems, money problems, boss problems. You showed me the pattern. I wasted a lot of time in the beginning wondering, when did I become an alcoholic? How did I become an alcoholic? Is there a way I could have avoided becoming an alcoholic? And you told me the old West Virginia saying, it don't matter how the mule got in the ditch, just get him out. And that helped me stop looking back and start looking ahead. And you said things to me like, if you want what we have, and I wasn't sure I did want what you had. Until one day, a young man that I'd gotten to know named Jeff came into our group looking to be in an extraordinary amount of emotional pain. And he sat there quietly while the general chair went through the usual announcements and boilerplates and reading and so on and so forth. And when he got to the point where he said, does anybody have a topic, a joy to share? Does anybody have a problem, a joy to share, or a topic suitable for discussion at an AA meeting? Jeff put his hand up and told us how his wife had been killed the night before by a drunk driver. This tragedy was not 24 hours old, and he was in an AA meeting looking for the help that he so desperately needed. And that's when it occurred to me that maybe you did have something that I needed and should want. And so I came to you and I said, what do I do? And I'm willing to give this a try, but how do I get started? And you took me over to the window shade on the wall that had the 12 steps, and you said, here's an outline of our program of recovery. And I said, good. I'll read through that and get back to you. And you said, well, there are things you have to read or should read. You really ought to read our basic textbook, Alcoholics Anonymous, that we affectionately call the Big Book. You should read 12 Steps and 12 Traditions that we call the 12 and 12. You ought to really read Living Sober. It has lots of good tips for early recovery in it. And when you get a little time, you ought to read AA Comes of Age so you know where we came from. But it's a program of action, you told me. You don't just read about these steps. You have to work them. Chapter 5 in our big book is called How It Works, not How It Kind of Sort of Happens. And I said, okay, well, I think I'm going to ease into this. I'll start with the easy steps. And you said, well, first of all, there are no easy steps. Done properly, all of these steps are a challenge. But secondly, did you notice the numbers? Those steps are in that order for a reason. That's the order in which you do them. And I said, well, does that make step number 1 the most important? And you said, yes. As a matter of fact, step number 1 is the most important, because without step 1, the other 11 are just conversation. And I said, well, it seems like an awful lot that you have to do. And you said, no, there are no musts in AA. There are no have-tos. There are a lot of damn well betters. But it's a program of suggestion, you told me, and it was only later that I found out that it's the sort of suggestion you give to a parachutist. We suggest you pull the ripcord. And you said, look, you're a newcomer. There's really only 2 things you have to know. 1, nobody in AA can tell you what to do. And 2, you better do what you're told. Look for the people whose recovery you respect, do what they did, and do what they do. And I really didn't understand what you meant. You said, look, if you come to a minefield and you see footprints walking successfully through it, walk in them. And that made sense to me. And so I got started. And my journey through the steps hasn't been easy. I worked step number 1 to the best of my ability, and I worked step 2 to the best of my ability, and I worked step 3 to the best of my ability, and faced with step 4, I came to a screeching halt. And I stayed stopped for a dangerous period of time. And eventually you came up to me and you said, what are you doing? And I said, I'm taking a break. And you said, these are steps, not porches. Get moving. And I said, well, look, I just did steps 1, 2, and 3. Surely that's a significant accomplishment. You said, absolutely. Steps 1, 2, and 3 are a significant accomplishment. But 1, 2, and 3 all by themselves are just duct tape. You need to work the entire program. And that got me unstuck and moving. And as I said, my journey hasn't been easy. If you go to the General Service Office in New York and you go into their archives, you will not see a portrait of me that has a plaque under it that says, worked the steps perfectly. Imagine my surprise that there wasn't a step 7.5. after having readied myself to be rid of my shortcomings in step 6 and having humbly asked my higher power to rid me of them in step 7, before I embarked on step 8, I thought there ought to be kind of an in-between step where you sit quietly for 15 minutes and all your shortcomings disappear. That hasn't happened. I'm still dragging my shortcomings around like Marley's chains. And I saw that in stark relief maybe 4 or 5 years into recovery when my father came to me and told me that my little Quaker mother had just come out of her 4th detox. She was a closet drinker, and if I saw evidence of it, I threw the same denial at it that I had thrown at my own drinking. But the reason I share that with you tonight is to remember my reaction to it. My reaction was, damn it, that's why I'm an alcoholic, because she's an alcoholic, and if my parents had told me about this in time, I could have avoided becoming one myself. Which, of course, is just nonsense. But the point is, I was thinking about me and my selfish needs and not her and the pain and the embarrassment and the fear that she was experiencing. So I have to remember that my character defects are swimming just beneath the surface. A friend of mine is fond of saying, my disease is out in the parking lot doing push-ups, just waiting for me to become complacent. You warned me about this. In the beginning, you told me that little ditty about, I used to be a drunken horse thief. Then I put down the cup. Now I'm just a horse thief. I haven't stolen any horses today, but I haven't forgotten how to. There was a Native American member of our fellowship that was trying to explain the conflicts that he felt inside, and he said it was like having 2 dogs constantly fighting inside. The good dog wanted him to stay sober, lead a principled life, help his fellows, and the bad dog wanted him to pick up or at least go back to his selfish, manipulating ways. And these 2 dogs were constantly in conflict with one another, and someone asked him, well, which one usually wins? And he thought, and he said, on any given day, the one that wins is the one I feed the most. And so I have to remember where to put my energies in terms of my recovery. Well, partway through the journey, I noticed the other window shade, the one with the 12 traditions. And I asked you, what's that all about? And you said, Alcoholics Anonymous has been around since 1935, and those principles are the reasons why. And I said, well, what's the difference between the steps and the traditions? And you said, well, the steps form the foundation of our legacy of recovery, and the traditions form the foundation of our legacy of unity. Well, I didn't understand any of that. You said, ignore the steps and the individual fails, ignore the traditions and the group fails. And I still wasn't sure what you were talking about, and so you brought it down to my level, and you said the steps prevent us from homicide or from suicide, and the traditions prevent us from homicide. And that I understood. And I said, well, it seems like a lot of rules. And you said, no, the traditions are like the banks of a river. They don't restrict us. They guide us. And I said, well, is tradition number 1 the most important? And you said, yeah, I suppose so. Tradition number 1 is our unity tradition, and that is they form the foundation of our legacy of unity. But you said the tradition that gets the most attention at any one time is the one that is at greatest risk. And in my personal opinion, the one that is at greatest risk these days is tradition 5, our singleness of purpose tradition. There was a young lady that made a presentation at a NERASSA some years ago on singleness of purpose, and she created such great images for me. I'm just going to steal from her unashamedly and share it with you. She talked about how Alcoholics Anonymous is a highly specialized program. We deal with alcoholism, and that's all. And from time to time, people come to us with other problems and other addictions, and we lovingly urge them to go to the fellowships that are better suited to deal with that. Now, if they have a problem with alcohol, absolutely, come on down. I don't care what else you have on your plate. But for help with those other problems, go to where you can get the specialized help you need. And we get some pushback on that says, well, it's all addiction and it's all recovery and it's all the same stuff. And the way she made the point was, if I need a heart transplant, I don't go to a brain surgeon just because they're both in the medical field. I go where I can get the specialized help that I need. And she talked about how when we do have folks in the rooms and explain this principle to them and explain what the house rules are for our meetings, we get some pushback where we're expected to change the ground rules. And she found that disrespectful. And the way she made the point was she said, if you have a friend who's a non-smoking vegetarian, you wouldn't go to your friend's house and say, hey, put out some ashtrays and where's the beef? You wouldn't be that disrespectful of your friend. Don't be that disrespectful of us. And she talked a bit about how rehab lingo is finding its way into the rooms of Alcoholics Anonymous. She talked a bit about 90 and 90. 90 and 90 is not an AA concept. We don't make 3-month plans for our recovery. We're a 24-hour program. We do it a day at a time. But the one she focused on was a drug is a drug is a drug. She said, if I have a heart attack and fall to the stage, please call an ambulance. Don't call an ice cream truck because a ride is a ride is a ride. I told that at the Massachusetts State Convention some years ago, and afterwards a young lady came up to me and said, was that the 2004 NERASSA? And I said, yes, it was. And she said, that was my presentation. And I said, well, I certainly hope I characterized it accurately. And she said, sort of. So I apologize to her for the plagiarism and the inaccuracies. When you share, imagine that there's a newcomer sitting there at their very first AA meeting. What will your sharing tell them about our program? What will your sharing tell them about our fellowship? I have 2 daughters, precious souls who to date have shown no need for this program. But if they ever do need it, I want the same program waiting for them that was here waiting for me. And that's your assignment. Well, at some point in the journey, I made mention to you that these legacies of recovery and unity were good stuff. And you told me there was actually a third legacy. There was a legacy of service. And I thought, oh, no, you're going to want me to do something. And you said, yeah, as a matter of fact. And you explained the economics of recovery to me. When I was out there, I took and took and took. And now it was time to give something back. But I didn't get into service right away. And the biggest impediment was fear. Now, we don't have time for me to list all my fears, but I'll tell you what the big 3 were. There was fear of rejection. I was afraid that if I were to offer myself in service to you, that you wouldn't want my service. But you have always found something for me to do, not always what I wanted to do, but something for me to do because there's an enormous amount of work to be done in Alcoholics Anonymous. I heard someone say once, everybody in AA has a right to be in service. And I thought, don't you mean an obligation to be in service? He said, no, a right to be in service. It's an integral part of our recovery. The second fear was fear of failure. I was afraid that whatever I would do would not be to your satisfaction. But you taught me a principle that has stood me in good stead in other aspects of my life, and that is if God brings you to it, God will bring you through it. And the third fear was fear of commitment. I didn't want to be at a certain place at a certain time to perform a certain chore. But you taught me that what might at first seem like a weight around my neck will ultimately prove to be an anchor in the storm. And that's been my experience with service. It's not without its challenges. I heard somebody share at a workshop once, service is miracle grow for character defects. And I thought, that can't be what they meant, but that was exactly what they meant. Now, this doesn't apply to anybody in this room, but if you know someone who's thin-skinned, has control issues, suffers from that dual malady of big ego, low self-esteem, they're going to find service a growth experience. And you know the old saying, if you like everybody in AA, you haven't been going to enough meetings. And if everybody in AA likes you, you haven't been in service long enough. But the benefits far outweigh the challenges. I mean, at the very least, service is the glue that has kept me attached to this program. But more importantly, it's put people in my life, people whose paths I would not normally have crossed. People who have enriched my recovery and who have enriched my life. And there are dozens of them in the room tonight. And I'm not going to make an attempt to point them out or name them because I'll forget somebody and you'll meet me out in the hall and hurt me. But you know who you are. You have brought riches to my life, and you have my gratitude for that. One of my past delegates, in fact, he's in the room this evening, Clay, once said, the finest people I know are in Alcoholics Anonymous, and the finest people I know in AA are in service, and that's been my experience. I spent the day a couple of years ago in the Allenwood Federal Maximum Security Federal Penitentiary here in Pennsylvania. We ran workshops, we ran meetings, we ate in the mess hall, we went out in the yard. And at some point during the day, one of the inmates came up to me and said, "Why do you bother to drive all the way out here and spend the day with the likes of us?" And the only thing I could think to say to him was, Alcoholics Anonymous saved my life, and anything I can do to give back is a small payment on a debt that I can never fully repay. I want to tell you just one quick service story, and then we have to think about wrapping up. Here in Eastern Pennsylvania at one time, we used to wear these service buttons at the area level that would let people know who had responsibility for public information, who had responsibility for the Treasury, who had responsibility for CPC, and so forth. And so I at one time was blessed with the opportunity to serve Eastern Pennsylvania as its area treasurer. And so I had a little service button that said, J. Gary, Treasurer. And I went to a district to make a Seventh Tradition presentation, and at the close of the meeting, we made our AA circle. It's never really a circle. It's more like a liver, which I always thought was kind of ironic. But we made our AA circle, and they chose to close that meeting with the Lord's Prayer. And about partway through the prayer, there was a young lady across the circle from me who she lifted her head, opened her eyes, and her gaze fell on my service button. And for the briefest of moments, the power of suggestion took over, and she said, you could hear her, "Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our treasurer." As if to say, Heavenly Father, please provide for us, and we're sure sorry about this guy. That's a true story, but it has no point. So let's wrap up, because as Mark Twain once said, it's a terrible death to be talked to death. And you people do need a chance to escape. I do want to say a quick word about the newcomer, however. I think of the newcomers as our children. And there's a well-respected parenting principle that says some children hear what you say, some children do what you say. All children do what you do. And so for the sake of that newcomer, we need to be the best living big book that we can be. And if you are that newcomer and you're still struggling with, am I really an alcoholic? Is alcohol really my problem? There's a lot of wisdom in the saying, if you think you may have a problem with alcohol, you probably do. And that always puts me in mind of the newcomer that was filling out one of those checklists. You know, do you ever not remember what you did when you drank? Do you ever drink more than you intended to? Do you ever miss work or school because of your drinking? You know those checklists. And it was all done. He went up to the old timer and he said, "How many yeses do you have to have before you're an alcoholic?" And the old timer said, "It don't matter, son. Only alcoholics fill out them things." So if you want to keep drinking, that's your business. But if you want to quit, we can help. The message of Alcoholics Anonymous is very simple. You do not have to live like that anymore. Now, how do we do that? There's a belief in one of our Native American tribes in a spirit being called the wounded healer. If a warrior goes into battle and is wounded, this spirit being will appear before him with an identical wound, and a spiritual energy flows between the two of them, and both wounds heal. And isn't that exactly what goes on in the rooms of Alcoholics Anonymous? There was a piece in the grapevine some years ago where a civilian was asking one of us, what's it like to be a recovering alcoholic? And the woman said, it's like being a pumpkin. God brings you in from the cold, washes all the dirt and grime off of you, opens you up and scoops out all the yucky stuff, including the seeds of doubt and greed and hate. He then puts on a brand new smiling face and puts his light inside of you for all the world to see. There are They're coming for one of you. So let's hurry. There are miracles in these rooms, and I want to, in closing, I want to share one of mine with you. Some years into recovery, I regained custody of my children. Alcoholism had once again come to their mother's home, this time in the form of their stepfather, and the courts felt that they would be better off with me. Imagine that. And quite a few years ago now, my younger daughter wrote me a letter for Father's Day, and I just want to read a couple sentences out of it. I want to try to read a couple sentences out of it. Above all else, I want to thank you for getting and staying sober. You are one of my best friends because of that choice, and I will never have thanked you enough. You are the best dad anyone could ever dream and pray for, and I feel honored to call you my dad. For me, there is not a lottery ticket out there worth more than that. Don't quit 5 minutes before your miracle. Well, going to an AA meeting is like going to an orgy. When it's over, you feel great, but you're never quite sure who to thank. So I thank all of you for your hospitality, for practicing patience and tolerance, and most importantly, for helping to keep me sober one more day. May God bless.